All right, guys, we're going to pick up with 2.4. This time, Mooney wanted to say hi and wish you luck on your notes. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So, with 2.4, we're talking about ecological tolerance. So, we're going to be describing what that is. We're going to have a little bit of a different skill this time than we've done before, which is identifying an author's claim. So, let's jump right into this. We do have a few units we're doing today, but they're not too difficult or intensive. So I think we'll be okay. So, what ecological range of tolerance is? It's just whatever range of conditions an organism can endure before they're going to either sustain injury or they're going to die. This could be things like temperature, pH, sunlight, salinity, a bunch of different things. It's important to understand that species as a whole and individuals within that species are going to both have a range of tolerance for all the different environmental conditions, and that is due to that genetic diversity we talked about. So, looking at our example here, salmon as a whole have a basic range of temperature that they can survive from 6 to 22 degrees Celsius, but some will have adaptations that give them a range of tolerance that is outside that basic range, so they can survive in a little bit colder or a little bit warmer temperatures. So when we look at this graph, this is showing you the different types of salmon. We consider all of these to be salmon, but these are essentially subspecies of salmon. So we've got our temperature here, and then our aerobic scope, which is just essentially um, how efficiently or how well they're using the available oxygen. So you can see that some of them are going to have adaptations that allow them to survive in warmer waters. Remember, warmer waters can't hold as much oxygen as cooler waters. So you can see that as temperature increases, like these gates, salmon here, they're, 17, 18 is going to be optimal for them. Um, but that graph is going to be shifted a little bit for our Chinook salmon. So they have a range depending on the species as a whole and as the individual because of that genetic diversity. So this right here, this example is showing you how some can survive in warmer waters. That's going to make some populations of them more resistant to disturbances like global warming, which are going to cause that temperature increase. So we've got three different zones we talk about. We've got the optimal range, which you can see is right here in the middle. Um, so with this is where they're going to thrive. This is where they're going to prefer to be. So because everything is right for them, they've got the right pH, they've got the right temperature. We're going to see the highest amount of individuals here because more are going to be able to survive and reproduce. Then we have the zone of physiological stress, which moves down here. Um, so here is where organisms are still going to be able to live. They're not going to die yet, but they could have some kind of stress like infertility or lack of growth or development or decreased activity. So we're not going to have as many organisms because of their inability to develop or reproduce. And then lastly, we have the zone of intolerance, which is where the organisms actually will be dying. Okay, that could be because of thermal shock, suffocation, lack of food, water, nutrients, oxygen. Um, and we're going to talk about some really important things when it comes to discussing these zones. If you are asked in an FRQ to talk about things like this, it's important to talk about the specifics. Don't just say, well, the zone of intolerance is where the salmon species die. Explain what happened. Was it that they went into thermal shock because the water got too hot or too cold? Did the water get so warm that there wasn't as much oxygen in the water, so they suffocated? You want to make sure you're naming the specific stressor that's causing the death. So let's look at some more of those writing tips for those FRQs. So if we have any FRQ that talks about human activities or even natural events that can cause a disturbance, we want to try to connect that answer to the range of tolerance. And if possible, if it's about human activity, always try to link it back to climate change if it's possible. So, for example, electricity generation, transportation, agriculture, these are all going to release carbon dioxide, which then causes climate change and the global warming. So, for example, you could say something like global warming shifts temperature outside the range of tolerance for many tree species, causing their populations to decline. So, you're stating the specific um, stressor for the tree, it's the temperature, and relating it back to global warming. You could also say the same thing about global warming warms up the ocean, which shifts temperature outside the range of tolerance for many species of fish, causing die offs. If you want to make your writing even stronger, try to connect that shift to a specific stress. So in these examples, we said it was the temperature um, that was causing them to be outside their range of tolerance. But let's look at, oh, sorry. Let's look at how we can be a little more specific about that. So, when I say physiological stress, I'm talking about things like suffocation, thermal shock, lack of food, water, nutrients, or oxygen. So here would be a really good answer, okay? So instead of just saying global warming warms the ocean, shifting temperatures outside the range of tolerance for many fish species, which is true, add that extra detail in there. Since global warming increases ocean temperatures and warm water holds less oxygen, fish may suffocate due to lack of oxygen. So you can see there in the red, we added that specific stressor that's going to cause the fish to be dying. Or similarly, instead of talking about just shifting temperatures, we can say global warming can increase droughts. And if we have increased droughts, rainfall patterns are going to shift outside the range of tolerance for many plant species. Once again, decent answer, but if we can add in that specific stressor, even better. So, without enough rainfall, these species may suffer population decline as their roots are unable to absorb enough water from the soil. So, our practice FRQ. Like I said, this is a new one. We haven't done this yet. But what I want you to do is I want you to read this passage, okay? And I want you to write just one sentence, write one claim that the author makes that could be proven and tested through an experiment. So you're essentially writing a hypothesis based on a claim that this author makes in their article. And then we're going to jump right into 2.5. This one's a little bit longer than 2.4, but it's not bad. So for this, we're looking at natural disturbances. So this is going to be any event that's going to disrupt how an ecosystem is structured or how it functions. So that could be disrupting the energy and matter cycling throughout that ecosystem. It could be displacing organisms or could even be destroying an entire ecosystem or habitat. These could be things like tornadoes, hurricanes, asteroids, forest fires, drought. Understand that these can be even greater than human disruptions. Now, I'm not downplaying human disruptions, and we're going to talk about those a lot in this unit, but understand that sometimes the natural ones are even worse. So, for example, the asteroid that hit Earth about 65 million years ago that killed the dinosaurs and a ton of other species, that's way worse than what we have done. Okay. So, a lot more disruptful. And we have three time frames that these disruptions can happen, these natural disruptions can happen on periodic, episodic, or random. So periodic is going to occur with pretty regular frequency. So we're actually able to relatively accurately predict when these are going to happen. An example would be in the savanna of Africa. They have dry and wet seasons that happen at the relatively same time every year. Episodic, these are going to be events that do happen very frequently, but they're going to be irregular. So we can't really predict exactly when they're going to happen. We know hurricanes happen, but we can't predict in advance when a hurricane is going to happen. And now with these, there can be some predictors to let us know when we're more likely to have these things happen. So, for example, fires. If we're in California, we could expect to see more fires in the summer than in the winter because of the environmental conditions. And then our random, it's exactly what it says. We know why these things happen, but they have no regular frequency. So things like volcanoes, earthquakes, asteroids, we know why they happen, but we have no way of really truly predicting when they're going to happen. So climate change, that's going to be a big topic we talk about this year. So right now we're going to focus on natural climate change, but understand that human caused climate change is also a huge issue. So once again, I'm not trying to downplay the human caused issue, but it is important to understand that this does happen naturally as well. So we have kind of this shift in our geologic time frame of our Earth's climate for a lot of different reasons. One reason is going to be the Earth's orbit and tilt. This is going to cause what we call mini ice ages and then warmer periods as the Earth slowly shifts closer to and further from the sun. So when we look at this picture here, we have this property that we call eccentricity, and that's essentially just how close the Earth is to the sun in its orbit. So about every 100 to 400,000 years, we have this slight shift in the Earth's orbit, which is going to bring it closer or further from the sun. So we see either cooler or warmer weather. Now we also every 40,000 years, we see a tiny shift in the tilt of the Earth's axis, which can bring certain hemispheres closer or further from the sun. Now, when we look at this graph is showing us in blue the levels of carbon dioxide over um, Earth's history, and then the temperature over Earth's history. So you can see those kind of cyclical changes of where the temperature and the carbon dioxide go up and down, um, on a relatively regular basis. So these can cause these over here are going to cause those regular changes that we're seeing. Now, it's important to notice that as the temperature changes, the carbon dioxide levels also change. Um, and that's going to be mostly due to the oceans. So as the temperature starts rising, the water in the ocean starts to warm up as well. And when that happens, more carbon dioxide is going to be released into the atmosphere, which just kind of creates this positive feedback loop of the earth getting warmer and warmer and warmer. And so when that positive feedback loop happens, we start to see those oceans warming up. We start to see polar ice caps melting, we start to see a rise in the ocean levels. Now, as it does get warmer, we start to see more plant growth. And as we start to see more plant growth, we start to see more oxygen being taken out of the atmosphere. And so, as more carbon dioxide. So, as more carbon dioxide is getting taken out of the atmosphere, we start to see that effect of the climate change kind of start to go down a little bit. Sorry, guys, the mail came and the dogs were not happy. But what I really want you also to see on this graph that's important to see and understand is that as we've gotten here closer to our history, to human history, and as we've gone through industrialization, we've seen way higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we've ever seen before in Earth's history. So going back to kind of that positive feedback loop I was talking about, that sea level rise is going to correlate with those higher temperatures. So you can see as we have these temperature spikes, we start to shortly after those temperature spikes, we see the sea level rising because the ice caps are melting. So um, it's just kind of this positive feedback loop where, remember, we said that's going to be the result of one process causing the process to continue onward. So the ocean gets warmer, can't hold as much carbon dioxide, more carbon dioxide is released, it gets even warmer, the ice melts, the amount of water in the ocean increases, and it just creates this loop that just goes and goes and goes. Now, as we have the environment changing, we start to see some habitat disruption. So these can be widespread habitat change or even complete habitat loss. Our big example here is going to go back to the sea levels, where they start to flood coastal and estuary habitats. And that is not good, okay? So when estuaries flood, we start to see a few bad things start to happen. So this is what it should look like normally. So you can see we've got some of those mangroves over here. We've got some plants. We've got our little edge forest. And then in the future, as the water rises, we start to get less and less sunlight. So now these plants over here that were able to get the sun before can no longer get any sun. So they start to die off. As the water levels rise, these mangrove trees can't survive that deep of water, so they're going to start to die out. So when that happens, we're losing important habitat. So we said that these estuaries were important for shellfish hatcheries. They are important habitats for birds. And so as we start to lose this edge habitat, we start to see less habitat available for those breeding grounds and for those birds to live in. So they're either going to have to migrate somewhere else because that habitat is not usable, or they're just going to die. Okay. Another thing we see from rising sea level um, is salinity increasing in these waters, because there is more ocean water mixing with the fresh water. The sea level salinity level starts to increase. Now, to kind of try to survive these disruptions, a lot of animals are going to be migrating. Now, this can be predictable. Okay, so if we're talking about those periodic events like the rainy and the wet season, wildebeest might migrate to follow the water availability and the plant availability, and so it's a pretty predictable migration. However, another one that this is a little bit I don't want to say worse, but it's not as predictable. So if we have the ocean species, as the ocean warms up, those warm water species are going to be able to move further north because the water temperature is going to be warmer. So that's good for them because they're gaining more habitat. But what happens is those colder water fish, they also have to start moving north. And that's going to take habitat away from them because the warmer water species are going to start kind of pushing into their habitat. So another one that we've seen happening recently is bird migration and breeding shifts. So when we look at this little diagram right here, so in the past, okay, so this was 1980 is what this half of the diagram is showing us, is that, whoop, go back, is we've got our biomass of caterpillars down here, and we've got kind of this breeding cycle of birds. So in the past, when the birds were migrating, they would come back in time to lay their eggs. just in time for them to hatch right before the peak mass of the caterpillar hatching. So it lined up really well. There was a lot of food available for those little hatchling birds. And so they got enough food, they were able to fledge, go on and live their life. But today, as that climate is changing, it's getting warmer, the caterpillars have actually started to hatch earlier. And so what we were seeing is that hatching date was no longer matching up with the caterpillars. It was actually at the very tail end of their hatching process. So what we could expect to see is birds starting to migrate earlier in the year, coming back a little earlier so they can lay their eggs a little earlier, so that hatchlings hatch a little earlier, so it goes back to lining up with the caterpillar hatching. So for our FRQ today, we're going to do some data analysis. So describing patterns or trends within visual data. So what you can see here is this is showing us change in first leaf date. So when leaves start changing color, okay, you can see our dark orange trees are now changing color more than 8 days earlier than they have in the past. Okay, so from 1951 to 1960 to 2006 to 2015, they're changing 8 days earlier than they were in the 50s. And then our blue ones, they're actually turning their leaves 8 days later than they used to. So what I want you to try to do is describe the relationship between latitude and change in the first leaf date that's depicted down here. Remember, latitude is how far north or south something is, and explain why you think that relationship exists. All right, 2.6. So here we're covering adaptations. So we're going to describe how organisms adapt to their environment. And once again, we're also going to describe relationships in data. So understanding fitness and adaptation, we've already talked about that all populations are going to have some genetic diversity in genomes. Some populations just have more and some have less, okay? And we're going to talk about a few reasons that genetic diversity exists. The first one is random mutations that happen when DNA gets copied. So you can see with this little diagram here, whoa, nobody needs my face that big. We just had originally a T in this base spot of our DNA. And through random mutation, it turned into a C. So that could create a completely new trait, a new fur color, maybe longer legs, maybe shorter canine teeth, something like that, okay? Another big reason we have these genetic diversity events happening is because of crossing over in the parent chromosomes. So that's going to create new combinations of genes, and so therefore we get new traits. So just remember we have that crossing over that happens in meiosis, where part of the mom's genes switches places with part of the dad's genes, and then they separate, recombine, and that's going to cause diversity. That's why if you have a sibling, unless you're an identical twin, you're not going to look identical to your sibling because you both got a little bit of different DNA from your mom and your dad. So when we talk about what an adaptation is going to be a trait that's going to be beneficial. So it's going to increase an organism's fitness or its ability to survive and reproduce. In nature, that's all animals are worried about is number one, not dying, and number two, reproducing. So that's what we consider to be their fitness. So the higher level of fitness would be the ones that can survive and then reproduce. So when we talk about these adaptations in relation to natural selection, organisms that have those adaptations are going to be better suited to their environment, and they're going to be better at surviving. And if they can survive, they're going to reproduce. And if they reproduce, they're going to be passing those traits on to their offspring. So then their offspring have those good traits. And as they reproduce, then they keep passing those good traits down from generation to generation. If we don't have those adaptations, we're going to see those organisms start to die off. And that could eventually lead to the entire population having the good adaptation over time. And that's how evolution works. Those with the bad trait don't survive well, so they don't reproduce, so they don't pass that trait on. And those that do have the adaptation survive well, reproduce, pass the trait on. So we start to see the trait more frequently in the population. Now, understand that all of that would not happen unless we had some kind of selective pressure or force. So that's going to be whatever environmental condition is going to be killing the individual that doesn't have the adaptation. So if we think about plants, okay, if you live in a desert and you're a plant, you have an adaptation to conserve water. If we took a plant out to the desert and tried to plant it and it had a high water need and it wasn't very good at conserving oxygen, that plant wouldn't survive very well. So it wouldn't be passing on its traits to the next generation. Whereas the ones who can conserve water will reproduce and will pass that trait on. So let's look at an example here. So we've got a species of mouse. Sorry. And we've got some fur color variation due to that genetic variation. We've got some tan mice and some brown mice here. Now, we've got our hawk up here, our predator. And since our background is dark, these mice that blend in, these brown mice, aren't getting eaten like the tan mice are. You can see originally we had 3 brown mice. After the hawk came and filled its belly up, we still have 3 brown mice. But over here, we started with 6 tan mice, and the hawk was able to very easily spot them. So it swooped down, caught them, and now there's only 2 left. So as those mice reproduce, the next generation, we're going to see more of those brown mice because there were more brown mice left after the selective pressure happened. So we could expect to see that these mice would be the ones that would get eaten first. So eventually we could expect to see all of the population having that brown fur. So this is an example of what we call microevolution, which is just a small change in a species that helps that species be able to survive, which then means they can reproduce. In this example, our hawk would be the selective pressure. In the example we talked about before, the amount of water would be the selective pressure. And it's important to understand that whatever environment an organism lives in is going to determine which traits are beneficial, so our adaptations, and which ones aren't. So if you're not a sports person, sorry, but I'm going to use a sport example here. So let's say we have a basketball player who is 7 foot tall, and that's going to be really good for basketball, right? They're going to be able to succeed in that environment of basketball. But if we took that same 7 foot person and said, okay, now we want you to go run a marathon, that's not going to be as easy for that 7 foot person. They're taller, they've got longer legs, which might seem good, but longer legs means it's going to take more energy to move those legs. So they're not going to be as successful in the habit or in the environment of being a marathon runner. If we have someone who's 5'6" and put them out on the basketball court with people who are 6'6", their height is not very beneficial to them, so it wouldn't be an adaptation. But if we ask them to go run a marathon, it's going to take them less energy to move their body. So you can see the environment determines if something is beneficial or not beneficial. So as the environment changes, different traits may become adaptations that weren't before, and old traits that used to be adaptations may actually start to become um, disadvantages to that organism. So, for example, if we have a drought, what we're going to start to see is that seeds are going to become kind of tougher on the outside. And so, if you're a bird that has a smaller beak that used to be able to crack open those seeds, now that's not that great because the seeds are tough and your beak is too small to crack them open. So having a larger beak would then become an adaptation. Whereas before it may have been a disadvantage because it took more energy to create that biomass of the larger beak, but now they're able to crack the seeds, so they're able to get that energy. We can see a real life example of this here. So we had these birds on an island in the West Indies, okay? And in 1976, you can see that the mean beak depth was about 9.5 millimeters. And then what happened was in 1977, there was a severe drought. So, like I said, that drought made those seeds tougher and harder to crack open. And within just 1 year, you can see that the mean beak depth went up to over 10 millimeters. Now, I understand that a difference of maybe zero point 0.6, zero point 0.7 millimeters may not seem like it's that large of a difference, but when you talk about that change happening in just 1 year, that is quite a big difference. Now, you can also see that the total number of birds went from 751 on the island to 90. So we had a huge bird die off because of that drought, because so many had these smaller beaks, they weren't able to survive. And then the pace of evolution is also an important thing to talk about. So, as an ecosystem or habitat changes very quickly, the less likely a species is going to be able to adapt to those changes. So, that's going to force them to either migrate out of the environment or they're just going to completely die. So if the ocean warms up too quickly, these species of fish aren't going to be able to migrate to cooler waters, and because warm water holds less oxygen, they're going to end up suffocating. Now, the more genetic diversity we have in a population, the better they're going to be at being able to adapt to environmental change. So there's a higher chance that some individuals will have good mutations that can survive the change. And then one of the other things we need to talk about is the longer the lifespan of an organism, the slower the rate is of evolution, because evolution happens by passing traits on to offspring. And things that have a long lifespan don't tend to reproduce as quickly or as often as things that live for a shorter time period. So when we look at some examples, bacteria and viruses, for example, they can adapt and evolve in a matter of days because they reproduce so quickly. But humans, we do not reproduce quickly. So our evolutionary process takes thousands to millions of years to happen. So for your practice FRQ today, you've got this table here comparing two islands and their average beak sizes and their individuals' beak sizes. And so what you're going to do here is you're going to describe the difference in the beak sizes and stop. Make a claim about why you think that difference is there. Okay, so describe what the difference in beak size is between the two islands and make a claim about why that could be. All right, and then the last topic we're going to talk about today is 2.7, which is ecological succession. So this one you learned back in regular biology. So this one shouldn't be too difficult here, hopefully. So we're going to be describing ecological succession, and we're going to once again explain patterns and trends in data to draw conclusions. We're also going to talk about the effect of succession on ecosystems. So when we talk about succession, it's just a series of predictable stages of growth that an ecosystem is going to go through. Now, for today, we're primarily going to focus on a forest. It tends to be the easiest one to see this change happen in, and it happens most often in forests. But understand that deserts, aquatic ecosystems, they all kind of have their own steps of succession as well. It's not just forests that do this. And understand that succession is always happening. Succession doesn't end. So we have two main types of succession. The first one's going to be primary succession, and that's where we're going to be starting from bare rock. So we're going to have no soil formation left there. And what we're going to see happen is that moss and lichen spores are going to be carried into that area on the wind, and they're going to grow directly on rocks, and that's going to break them down to form soil. Newt wanted to come back. Oh, he wanted to leave. And then we have secondary succession, which is going to start from already established soil in an area where there's been a disturbance, like a fire, a tornado, we've cleared land for agriculture. And this is going to clear out the majority of plant life. Now, for this one, instead of having to go and start with the moss and lichen, we're going to see plants like grasses, sedges, wildflowers, berry bushes. They're going to have their seeds dispersed either by the wind or animal droppings, and that will be the first species that we start to see there. So this graphic right here is a pretty good graphic. It's showing you primary succession. Okay, so we're starting with bare rock. We've got then our lichens that show up, and lichens are actually going to live directly on that rock and break that rock down into soil. So we'll have kind of shallow soil at first that doesn't have a ton of nutrients in it, so it can only support some small plants. And then over time, as that soil grows and deepens, we can start to see intermediate species, grasses, shrubs, very shade intolerant, so sun loving species showing up. And then eventually, our climax community of our shade tolerant large trees. And then we've got our secondary succession here, where you can see we still have soil left. We don't have to create that soil. So we're still going to have pioneer species, but this time, instead of it having to be lichens, we'll see our annual plants, our grasses and perennials, and then from there, it's essentially the same as primary. Okay, we've got our intermediate and our climax. This just doesn't take as long as primary because the soil is already established. So let's look a little bit at the stages of succession, and the stages are going to be characterized by what types of plants dominate that ecosystem because different species are adapted to each of those different stages. So in our pioneer or our early succession species, the ones that are appearing first, this is going to be where when we're in primary, we've got bare rock, or if we're in secondary, we've got bare soil. And so these plants are going to have seeds that are spread by wind or animals. They're going to be fast growing, and they're going to be able to tolerate shallow soil that may not be as nutrient rich and full sunlight because there's nothing there to provide shade for them. So moss and lichen, those are going to grow on that bare rock, and then wildflowers, raspberries, grasses, sedges, weeds, that's going to be in our secondary. Then we have our intermediate or our mid-successional species. Those are going to appear after pioneer species have already helped to develop that deeper soil with more nutrients by their cycles of growth and death. So as these show up, as they die, their organic matter gets added back to the soil. So their nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon adds nutrients to the soil and helps to create that deeper nutrient-rich soil. The characteristics of our intermediate species are going to be relatively fast growing. They're going to be larger plants that are going to need deeper soils than our pioneer species do. And once again, they're going to be sun tolerant because there's still no shade. So these are going to be things like shrubs, bushes, fast-growing tree species like cherry, pine, aspen. And then we have our late successional or our climax community species. And these are the last ones to show up. So after our soil is deep, it's enriched, it's got those nutrients from the early and the mid successional species growing and dying. And these are going to be large, slow growing trees. And they're going to be very tolerant of shade because they're going to be growing in the understory of those intermediate species. So those intermediate species are creating shade that these guys have to be able to live in until they outgrow those intermediate species. These are also going to require very deep soils because they're going to have large root networks to anchor these trees, because these are the large trees that can grow hundreds of feet tall, things like maples, oaks, um, and all the other large trees that exist. So you can see, I like this diagram because it really shows you how that soil is impacting what is growing there. So this one is showing us primary succession because it's got that bare rock to start with and no soil. And then as that organic matter returns to the ground, the soil gets deeper and deeper and deeper, which can lead to our large trees being able to root themselves and survive. So let's talk just a little bit about primary succession. So this is going to occur somewhere where there haven't been plants. This could be volcanic rock. This could be rock that's exposed after a glacier has retreated. And the first thing that's going to show up there are moss and lichens. They're going to grow directly on the rock. And they're actually going to do this because they can secrete these acids that are actually going to start breaking down the rock through chemical weathering. And by doing that, it's going to release the minerals that are held in the rocks that they need. So when we combine that chemical weathering of the moss and the lichen with the organic matter from the moss and the lichen dying, this starts to form this initial very shallow soil. Okay. This here is an example. So yes, I know there are trees back there, but I'm not talking about that area. I'm talking about this area right here. That's just a bare rock field with lichens growing on those rocks. Okay. And so they're going to break those rocks down into this very shallow soil that you see here. And then from there, we can kind of combine the two because they have kind of the same flow after that first step. So our secondary succession, this is where we already have established soil, but our plant life is gone. Our pioneer species are still going to be wind dispersed or animal dispersed through animal waste. So animals have eaten them somewhere else and brought them to this area. Um, if we have this happening because of a wildfire, we tend to actually see a very nutrient rich soil there because as the fire went through and burned the trees, all their organic matter got returned to the soil. So overall, this is a much more rapid process than primary succession. We don't have to create soil. And a lot of times the soil that's already there is very well established and nutrient rich. So remember, we have to start with a disturbance still, but we're able to skip that stage of soil building and jump right into some annual plants, grasses, things like that growing. So our practice FRQ for today is based on the graph below. Explain whether spruce trees are an early, middle, or late successional species. So the graph is showing you individuals of spruce trees per hectare in the time in years since glacial retreat. So since we're looking at glacial retreat, this is going to be an example of primary succession, but it's important that you pay attention to the time and how their growth changes over time. So make sure you explain it. Don't just say, I think it's early, middle, or late. Say, I think it's early, middle, or late because of whatever your proof is that you find in this graph. And before I end the video, I just don't want Lily to feel left out because she's the only one who hasn't made an appearance yet. So there's my Lily bug. Bye, guys.